Good morning, everyone. We're going to go ahead and begin our JLAC hearing. We are here this morning to get an update on how we, as a state, are spending our federal stimulus dollars and to try to ensure that we are not at risk of losing any federal money. And if we are at risk, to identify ways to prevent that from happening. As we all are painfully aware, we are in the midst of a budget crisis, and we have to make every dollar count in our state. In February 2009, the federal government passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. California received billions of dollars from that act to help stimulate our economy and create job growth. All of this money came attached with spending deadlines, and those deadlines are quickly approaching. In July and August of this year, the state auditor issued a series of letters, reports that highlighted the Department of Community Services and Development, the Energy Commission, and the Department of Education. These reports provided an update on how each agency is spending stimulus funds and if they are at risk of not meeting the federal deadlines. The auditor identified some serious concerns that could mean we will be leaving millions of dollars on the table unspent. This is not an option for us. We need to make sure that we are doing everything we can to spend these dollars expeditiously and efficiently. The spending deadlines range from September of this year to September of 2013, if I'm correct. Today we will hear from the auditor and the affected agency to determine any steps that need to be taken to make sure no stimulus funds revert back to our federal government. Before we begin, I'm going to ask, it looks like Sergeant's calling members. So we would invite members of the JLAC committee to please come to room 444 for the hearing. And with that, we'll have our state auditor begin. Welcome, Ms. Howe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First, I thought I would start out just kind of a high-level overview. I mean, as you indicated, the Recovery Act was signed by the President back in February of 2009, and what my office did at that point in time was really took a look at the various programs for which the state of California applied for, excuse me, for funding, and realized many of those programs were programs that we audit on an annual basis as part of the single audit. But then we also identified programs, federal programs, for which California, prior to the Recovery Act, received small amounts of money, and I mean small in $5 to $10 to $15 million, but with the influx of the passage of the Recovery Act, those programs such as weatherization now would receive $186 million, or the energy program went from a small amount to $226 million. So we saw this as an area of challenge and certainly of risk for the state of California to make sure we were well prepared as a state entity to expend these funds in a prudent manner. So we identified at least those two programs as high risk. The other program or department we'll be talking about today is the Department of Education. Although that was not part of our JLAC audits where we were looking at specific programs, that we included the Department of Education as an agency that administers several federal programs and received significant amounts of money through the Recovery Act, particularly the State Fiscal Stabilization Fund. So based on issues we have identified during our annual single audit of federal programs that education administers, we identified many internal control concerns over the years. So we felt, again, this was an agency that we needed to pay particular attention to. So that's why the Department of Education is one that we've done some follow-up work on as well. So as you indicated, Mr. Chair, there are several programs in the state. We'll talk about a few of those today when we talk about these three different agencies. But at this point, we're seeing that there's a risk of the state not expending upwards of $8 billion. Some of that, I think, as we hear today, some of that will actually be spent, but there are a few programs that we'll highlight today that my office is particularly concerned about based on some of the work that we've done this summer. So that's kind of a high-level overview. I don't know if you want me to move into the first agency.
Yes, why don't we do that?
Okay, thank you. The first department we were going to talk about, and this is the weatherization program. This is administered by the Community Services and Development Department. And as I indicated, originally, weatherization, I think, got about $6 or $7 million. With the Recovery Act, California was awarded $186 million to expend. And the grant that California received expires March 31st of next year. So we're only a few months away from this actual grant being expiring and not having those funds available, and the possibility of some funds reverting back to the federal government. In addition to the Recovery Act monies, there are also annual grants, as I indicated. So not only is CSD trying to expend funds specifically that were awarded via the Recovery Act, but they had their annual awards they had to continue to administer as well. So that added a little bit to the challenge. Of the $186 million that California was awarded, and I don't know if you have our letters in front of you, Mr. Chair. Okay. So if you look at the table, and I don't know, oh good, you guys have them too. On Table 1 on page 2 of our letter, you'll see the Recovery Act and the other two grants shown in the table. Of the Recovery Act, $158 million of weatherization funds, you'll see in the second column, they have awarded $141 million. So that's a good, sizable chunk of the money that's been awarded and essentially awarded out to contractors and nonprofits that are going to be doing the weatherization, going out and weatherizing homes for low-income families. But as you can see in the next column, as of April 30th, of that $141 million, only about $68 million had been spent. And then there's unspent funds of $89.9 million. Those two amounts add up to the $157. So some of the unspent is amounts that have not yet been awarded as well. Our concern is, as we've been monitoring this program, there are two things that drive the expenditures: the number of homes that the state is able to weatherize and the average cost for those homes. So what the department had originally estimated is that they would spend about $3,660 per home to weatherize and to do things like replacing windows, modifying HVAC, just caulking windows if they have dual pane or they didn't feel a need to modernize those particular windows, insulation in the attic, etc. All types of typical weatherization measures you would see. But when we went in and took a look at what they were actually spending on average, it was about $2,559, $2,560 per home. Therefore, the expenditures were significantly less than what they expected. Back in April, when we were looking at the program, they were actually about $30 million short of their planned expenditures. And part of it is because the average cost, because they weren't doing as many measures. They weren't doing as much weatherization to each individual home as they had anticipated. The other concern was the number of homes that they actually were able to weatherize, and some of that tied to not being able to get some of the service providers on board quickly enough, certain regions in the state, and I'll touch on this in a minute, certain regions in the state where we didn't have service providers available for a long period of time, and so we're somewhat in the catch-up mode. But following along, as far as looking at the annual grants, you'll see in that table as well the annual grants for both 2009 and 2010. One grant, we have about $4.2 million in unspent funds, and another grant about $5.5 million. And those have a few more months, 3 more months for expenditure, but you're still looking at almost $100 million of unspent funds as of April of this year. So we certainly have some concerns about that. In Table 2, which is on the next page, this is where we had some of the average costs that I was referring to. So if you look at the middle columns, you'll see for the Recovery Act grant, they had planned to spend about $3,660, as I indicated, per home, and they've spent about $2,539. So that's part of the reason that we aren't spending the funding as quickly as we had anticipated. And as of April, as I indicated, they were about $30 million short in expenditures. And then the annual grants, they actually are in a similar situation where they had planned to spend about $2,500 per home, spending approximately $1,600. So again, coming up a little bit short, and some of that is because not enough service providers up through that point in time, and the measures, as they refer to them, they weren't doing as much weatherization per home as anticipated. So the next part of the letter I'm going to highlight a little bit, and this is where we had some of the service providers had not begun weatherizing homes. We really have had some concerns early on when we did the initial audit. There were several service providers that CSD hadn't signed up yet, hadn't gotten into contracts with. Part of that, to be fair to the department, is there were new requirements that the state of California had to meet because of the Recovery Act, and that's Davis-Bacon requirements, which is essentially requires prevailing wage, not something that we've had to deal with in the past. So, as we indicated in our initial report, some of the fault, quite honestly, fell on the federal government because some of the guidance that came out didn't come out quickly enough, and states, not only California but other states, were really scrambling to educate service providers to get them on board as to what they needed to do to be able to comply with Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage. But with that said, we had three particular service providers, three geographic regions that we were concerned about back when we conducted the first audit, and we still had some concerns when we did the follow-up work. The first was the city of Oakland. They actually forecast that they would weatherize 269 homes by April 30th of 2011. They had spent about $228,000. Their award was $1.9 million from CSD, but as of April 30th, although they estimated 269 homes, they had not weatherized any units at that point in time. We found a similar situation in San Francisco. The city and county of San Francisco forecast that they would weatherize 204 units by April 30th of 2011, and in fact, they had not weatherized any homes either. And then the final region is Los Angeles. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power actually forecast that they would weatherize 806 homes by May 31st. But when we took a look, they had only weatherized about 78 units at that point in time, a little less than 10% of their estimate. But they actually had expended about 43% of their award, so that raised some concerns in our mind. So we brought that to the attention of the department to take a hard look at that particular providers in that particular region. So again, this is one of the concerns that we identified as far as the service providers estimating they were going to be able to complete a certain amount of work by this past April, and in fact fell far short of the expectations. As I indicated in my comments a little bit earlier, some of the reason why the expenditures are low is because few of the measures are being installed. I mean, there was an expectation that there would be a variety of measures installed in particular homes, and that the providers would be able to go in and either do an energy audit or use some predetermined protocols as to what types of measures to include. But what we were seeing, and also the U.S. Department of Energy came out last fall and actually audited and went in and looked at some homes, a sample of homes, and they raised concerns as well, because what they were seeing was light bulbs being switched out to CFLs, a water heater blanket being installed, low flow shower heads, but not seeing the more expensive, more beneficial energy or measures, weatherization measures being installed in the homes. So not only did we raise that concern, but certainly the U.S. Department of Energy did as well. In addition, the U.S. Department of Energy came back out in April of 2011, this year, and inspected 4 homes, and again found similar concerns. They looked at 4 houses. 3 of the 4 had only those minimal measures, again, as I referred to, the CFLs, the water heater blanket, some insulation on pipes, shower heads, faucets, etc., but not the larger items that you would expect to see, such as attic insulation, ceiling around ducts, and the windows, weather stripping it being installed, etc. So there were some pretty significant concerns that not only we raised, but certainly the U.S. Department of Energy raised when they came out and conducted their monitoring visits. So the last piece I wanted to talk about a little bit is, and this is where we raise our concerns about whether or not we're going to be able to expend the funds by the time this grant expires. So if you move on to page 5 and you look at table 3, you'll see up through April of 2011, there was about a 1-year window that we looked at, April 2010 through April 2011. The average monthly production was about 1,877 homes. The capacity through the expiration of the grant, which would be through March of next year, we project 20,647 homes would be weatherized at that pace, but we would fall short. Again, we would have $89 million remaining at an average annual cost of $2,539, we're needing to weatherize over 35,000 homes. So we're almost 15,000 homes short, which means there's going to be a significant amount of money left on the table, or perhaps reverting back to the federal government. The annual grants, we think they may be on pace. They may be okay with regard to the annual grants. A similar table on the next page is showing you if the this is looking at it from the cost side of things. So if we have $89 million left and we're only able to weatherize another 20,000 homes, if the average cost remains at $2,500 a month, we're going to fall short. We actually need to see the costs increasing. Now, it may sound odd for an auditor to say we need to increase costs, but to increase costs means you need to be conducting better energy audits, putting more beneficial measures, doing more things to individual homes or units that will not only benefit the residents of that particular unit, but also make best use of the Recovery Act dollars so that we don't leave any money on the table and that funding reverts back to the federal government. So those in a nutshell are the concerns that we raise. So it's not only the pace as far as the number of homes or units being weatherized, but also the cost, which ties to the types of measures that are being installed in each of those homes. So with that, I can answer any questions, or you can have the department come up, whatever your pleasure.
Thank you, Auditor. Why don't we have the department come up now to address some of those concerns you brought out in your audit. I'd like to invite Ms. Lene Stout, the Acting Chief Deputy for CSD, to please come to the table and join us in this discussion. Go ahead.
Good morning. Chairman Lara and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you this morning and to provide an update on the department's efforts to maximize federal resources to assist low-income families in the area of weatherization. My name is Lene Stout, and I joined the Department of Community Services and Development as the Acting Chief Deputy Director 3 months ago. I'd like to provide some brief general comments to the committee and then answer any questions you may have. Also from the department is Jason Wembley, Chief of the Energy Division, who will help in answering your questions. CSD is still in the process of administering ARRA-funded services, which are available for weatherization assistance programs funded by the United States Department of Energy through March 2012. This funding provides eligible households with services designed to improve the energy efficiency of their home, thereby reducing energy usage and cost for low-income households while also safeguarding the health and safety of the household. Income eligibility is set at 60% of the state's median income, which is approximately $47,800 for a family of 4. The goal of all programs administered by CSD is to improve the quality of life for low-income Californians. This is generally achieved under the weatherization program by reducing the energy burden of low-income households, but requires that emergency health and safety measures are resolved before any weatherization services can be done. Examples of health and safety measures include replacing defective heating and or cooling units, repairing or installing repairing carbon monoxide leaks, and installing smoke detectors. I'd like to specifically address the findings of the Bureau of State Audits in their letter to the members released on July 11th of this year. The BSA has been examining CSD's capacity to administer these ARRA funds since they were first provided back in 2009. We appreciate their review because it has highlighted issues that need to be addressed, and their analysis continues to be useful to us in doing just that. The BSA analysis focused on the performance trends of the local providers in the area of rates of production, unit cost averages, and total expenditures through April 30th, 2011. The BSA acknowledges that although we are likely to achieve our goal of weatherizing over 43,000 homes, our costs per home of weatherization are not running as high as originally estimated. This means we have to weatherize more homes and or provide more services per home to drive up the cost to fully expend ARRA funding for weatherization, as the auditor pointed out. I'd like to point out that CSD did meet the federal unit production benchmark last fall, and we received the second half of the ARA grant. We've obligated all of the local assistance dollars, which are those funds going to local providers to weatherize homes. In addition, there are several important departmental efforts underway to maximize the federal resources coming into California to ensure little, if any, funding is left in Washington. First of all, we have seen an increase in both expenditures and production since the April timeframe. With actual numbers through July 2011, we've increased the number of homes weatherized from 26,800 highlighted in the BSA's letter to 32,425, which is 75% of our projected goal. In addition, we have increased the average per unit cost from approximately $2,500 to $2,700. Given these actual data at the current production and expenditure rate, our analysis shows that the BSA's identified $37 million at risk has been lowered to approximately $28 million, so about a $10 million reduction. In addition, the department is undertaking a number of additional measures to enhance the most recent current rate of production. Second, the BSA letter makes mention that Department of Energy ARA local service providers have installed fewer weatherization measures because of delayed implementation of new state protocols referred to as energy audits, expanding required items for installation. Since the rollout of the new protocols in April, CSD has provided additional training and technical assistance to improve crew proficiency in applying the new protocols and to facilitate statewide implementation of these protocols. We anticipate that with this training and full implementation, we will continue to see increased production over the remaining months ahead. The third point that I would like to highlight is that over the past couple of months, we have convened a number of meetings with our network of energy provider associations to examine actual production of each of our 39 ARA local energy providers. Together, we are in the process of engaging our local providers in addressing individual barriers to production and identifying realistic goals for each provider's production for the remaining months of ARA. And over the course of the next months, we will, if necessary, reallocate resources to those providers who have the greatest ability to deliver actual production. Fourth, this collaborative process with our network of energy provider associations and individual providers has resulted in the state's identification of key federal issues that are barriers to California's ability to maximize the production goals. We escalated these issues to Department of Energy last month, and we continue to have discussions on needed federal flexibility so our providers can enhance their production to meet our goals. In fact, DOE visited California earlier this month, and we met with them and discussed these issues. We have already been able to reach agreement on some of the issues that were raised, and DOE has committed to follow up on some of the other requests that would help expedite the process of identifying eligible units and increasing the number of measures that can be done. Fifth, we're continuing to work with the local service providers to increase production, and one aspect of this is targeting more multifamily buildings that result in higher investments. We are working with the Association of California Community and Energy Services, or ACCESS, in providing additional technical assistance to help providers quickly address and overcome challenges involved in weatherizing these larger scale buildings, which will augment our rate of production. And to address one of the challenges in weatherizing large multifamily buildings, we have identified a pool of qualified contractors that can conduct the specific energy audits required for the multifamily buildings, since most of the local providers do not have the expertise on staff to perform these audits. We have also been working with the utilities, California Housing Authorities Association, and California Housing Partnership in targeting multifamily buildings. In addition, we are exploring possible opportunities with the Regional Council of Rural Counties in working with weatherization providers in some of the more rural areas to increase production through leveraging. The final point I'd like to make to the committee is that in addition to our efforts to increase production, we worked within the Brown administration to seek a federal extension for expending ARA funding. Though our efforts will enable us to maximize the federal resources coming into California under our remaining months of ARA, the truth is that when ARA weatherization was first launched, there was a delay for nearly a year before appropriate federal guidance was given to states on the prevailing wage issues, as Ms. Howell identified earlier. Prior to our weatherization program did not need to comply with Davis-Bacon prevailing wage standards. Post-ARA, we did. This and other new requirements triggered extensive changes to service agreements with providers that had to be negotiated, which ultimately caused further delays in production. So this administration has worked to officially request from Department of Energy a year's extension of ARA funding. I want to close by again thanking you for your ongoing attention to this issue. Weatherization services are a critical resource that CSD is able to provide to thousands of low-income families across California in an effort to decrease their energy burden. We are fortunate to have an incredibly committed and talented staff at the department, and equally fortunate to be working with a strong network of local energy service providers across California who actually provide the services and who are committed to maximizing all of these resources to eligible low-income Californians. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stout. Appreciate your testimony. I do have a couple questions. The first one I'd like to ask is about the extension that the administration's asking for. Is there any update on that extension thus far?
We haven't had anything officially updated. We have had some conversations, and it is moving forward, being the request is moving through Department of Energy.
And do you feel confident we will be able to get that extension?
I feel hopeful, yes.
Okay. My other question for you was, I appreciate the work that's being done to address the issues. I wanted to see if there's a way I can get a list of the homes that have been weatherized thus far in the state and what the services that were being rendered for each of those. I'm just curious to figure out where these homes are at and what are the type of services that were offered. And then my other question for you is, I know there's this discrepancy between I get the prevailing wage issue. I get the fact that the feds didn't give you full, requirements a year later. But do you think with the 1-year extension, we're actually going to be able to expend those funds, the ARA funds? What would it be, March 2013?
Yes, and actually, we believe that we wouldn't even need a full year in which to expend the funds.
Okay. Okay. Well, I look forward to continue working with you on this issue. I also want to put out there that I'm willing to help in any way I can to get the extension and make sure that we utilize all our funding. And I like the fact that we're looking at multifamily housing dwellings as well, because I think it's very important. I think it would also get us more bang for our buck as well. So thank you for your testimony today. I appreciate you coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you. The next topic we're going to talk about is the Department of Education. Wait, I'm sorry. We're skipping that for right now.
Threw me off there for a second.
Just making sure you're awake.
You caught me.
Next, we're going to move to the Energy Commission. I believe the spending deadline for the commission is April 30th of 2012. Ms. Howell will brief the committee on regarding her July 14th report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you indicated, yes, this is the State Energy Program, one of the programs for which the Energy Commission is responsible for administering the funds, particularly the Recovery Act funds, and this is very similar to the weatherization program that we just talked about, where it was a major influx of funds into the state of California. The total award for the state of California for the state energy program alone is $226 million. We originally took a look at this program back in 2009 as part of a JLAC audit request that was approved by the committee back then, and we issued our report specific to the Energy Commission and the administration of this program in December of 2009. And essentially what those early reports were trying to assess is how well prepared is the state of California to administer Recovery Act awards. And we had some pretty serious concerns when we issued the report back in December of 2009. And with our letter report that we issued in July of this year, almost 2 years later, we still have some pretty significant concerns about whether or not the state of California is going to be able to fully avail itself of this $226 million. And what I'd like to take you to, I think the easiest way to step you through this is to look at the table that we present in the letter report on page 2. It shows you 9 different programs, essentially, that the Energy Commission intends to administer with state energy program dollars. And I want to point your attention to the right-hand column when you see percentage remaining to be spent. As you indicated, Mr. Chair, that these grant awards expire April 30th of 2012, which is about 8 months from now. And you're seeing some programs here for which it's a significant percentage of funds that remain to be spent. When you're seeing programs that have over 80% of the dollars remaining to be spent, and we only have 8 months, raises two concerns in our mind. Number one is, are we going to be able to expend the dollars via these different programs that Energy Commission is administering, number one. Number two, even if we are able to accomplish it, as an auditor, it raises concern in our mind as to how risky are those expenditures. Are those expenditures going to be appropriate? Are we running ourselves up against the wall as far as we need to expend this money quickly? And it raises the possibility that some of those expenditures may not be appropriate. And if the federal government comes in and does some audit work, or we have to do some audit work as part of our normal single audit, and we go in and we find questionable expenditures or inappropriate expenditures, the state of California is going to have to, send that money back, or they'll offset future grants to the state. So we think there's significant risk here. As you can see in the table, the second column is the expenditures reported by the Energy Commission as of June 9th of this year. They were asserting that they had spent $69.9 million, which again is a fairly small percentage. That's 31% of the $226 million. But when my audit staff went in and really took a look at it and said, how much has actually truly been spent? It's the next column over, which is $42.7 million. The difference is there's a couple of programs for which we may have drawn down the money from the federal government and awarded it and I'll give you a couple of examples, to a department. So, for example, Department of General Services received some money. EDD received some money for some of these programs, but those state entities have not actually spent the money. But Energy Commission is considering it an expenditure because it's been awarded to another state entity. It's just a semantics, and that's why we felt it was important to go in and identify what actually has been spent out the door to either create jobs or to administer a particular program and provide benefit. And it's about $42.7 million. Again, so we're seeing $183 million remaining unspent, which is 81%. And this grant, again, as I said, expires in 8 months. So we have some pretty significant concerns. I was going to highlight a few of the programs that are identified in the table. If you look at the second one from the bottom, so the bottom is program administration. That's what Energy Commission is able to retain for its own purposes to administer all these different programs. As you can imagine, they have a lot of responsibilities, not only the reporting responsibilities, but for administering all these programs. So that's what the $12 million is. But if you go up one line and you see energy efficient state property revolving loan program. This is the one that there's been funds awarded to the Department of General Services, and this was to essentially make state buildings more energy efficient. So $25 million actually allocated to the Department of General Services, and that we found that happened at least a year ago. When we issued our December 2009 report, we were reporting out about that $25 million being awarded to DGS. Unfortunately, as you can see in the amount actually spent column, we're only seeing about $9 million of that has been spent at this point in time. So we have $16 million unspent. So we have some concerns with regard to that. If you move up to the second line item down where you see another $25 million amount, it's this low-interest loans. If you slide over again, we agree that there's been about $3.5 million spent. But again, if you go to the amount remaining unspent, you're looking at another $21 million that has not been expended. That's about 86% of this grant award. So that's a significant amount of money that needs to be spent. So in this one, we asked, and the Energy Commission asserted that there are several projects that have been completed, 7 out of 28 projects. 15 of those were in progress. 6 had not yet even been started. Those 6 that have not yet been started represent almost half of the unspent money. So if those projects haven't even been started yet, and where the clock is ticking, we're, again, putting ourselves kind of up against the wall as far as being able to get the money spent and spending it appropriately. The other one, and you can stop me if I'm going into too much detail. The top line I wanted to highlight, this is one Clean Energy Workforce Training Program. The reason I wanted to highlight this one, this is funding that went to the Employment Development Department, and this was really to create green jobs and to provide training to individuals to develop the skills to work in the green energy profession. So in this case, we see this one is probably the most successful. As you can see, there's only about 47% that's not been spent. When we've looked at this program in the past, over the last year and a half, we did see that the Employment Development Department did report that there were several individuals receiving training in this particular area of expertise. So that one is in our mind, has been the most successful of all of the programs that the Energy Commission is administering at this point in time. The remaining programs, as I indicated, I certainly can go into detail, but I think this table really does point out the concerns that we have with regard to how slowly these programs have gotten up and running, and the prospect of potentially leaving a significant amount of money on the table. Do you
have an estimate of how much we would be leaving on the table?
Well, we didn't really specifically estimate. I mean, our concern is these programs have been awarded to the state of California for about 2 years now, and we've only spent 19% of the funding. If we only have 8 months left, and it took us 2 years to spend 19%, you're looking at spending another 10-15% perhaps by April if it stays at the same pace. Now, if they modify it, when we were looking at the Commission, and I'm sure they'll comment on this, they have been looking at some of these programs and trying to determine whether they need to redirect some of these funds to other programs. I don't know if it's within this listing of 9, but they were back in June when we were conducting some of the audit work on this follow-up, really trying to determine whether or not they needed to make some adjustments because we're trying to exercise our due diligence and being respectful of the Energy Commission, but really pressing them to say, we're running out of time here, so we really need to understand what your plans are. So it is my understanding that they do plan to redirect some funds away from some subrecipients or recipients who are just demonstrating that they're not going to be able to spend the funds. So I would defer to the Energy Commission with regard to any adjustments they've made since we were in there back in June. And
your concern is that in this mad rush to spend the money, there might be some questionable expenditures?
Absolutely. That's one of the high risks of fraud. If you have a compressed period of time where we've got to spend $183 million in 8 months, there's certainly the opportunity for inappropriate activity to be occurring in the need to expend the dollars so that they don't revert back to the federal government. So we have some pretty serious concerns about the risk there.
Okay. Mr. Alejo, welcome. If you have any questions, feel free to wave your hand over here. I will now going to call the chairman of the Energy Commission, Chairman Weisenmiller, sorry, and Executive Director Oglesby to the table to address some of the concerns brought up by our state auditor. Welcome, gentlemen, and feel free to start.
Good morning, Chairman Laura and other committee members. I want to make a few brief remarks in advance of handing off the microphone to the Energy Commission's Executive Director, Rob Oglesby, who will give the bulk of the presentation on behalf of the CEC today regarding the status of the ARA funds. Thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning. I wanted to be here this morning since one of my #1 priorities as Chair of the Energy Commission is to make sure that the federal stimulus funds administered by the Energy Commission are spent efficiently and effectively and on time. Californians need and want the jobs and energy savings that will result from these investments. That this particular assignment for the Commission has been a tremendous challenge is an understatement. However, our staff is guided by a committee of 2 commissioners, of which I am one, and an executive director dedicated to constantly monitoring the solicitations and accounts and the staff's ongoing efforts to push the vendors, cities, counties, and all relevant entities to get the money out the door according to plan and as swiftly as possible. The trick is that we want it done fast, but we want it done right. maximizing jobs and energy savings along the way, but spending it effectively. Meeting these criteria don't always fit together. Ultimately, I'm confident we will meet the federal expenditure timelines and put the money effectively to work for California, but it's not easy. Mr. Oglesby will specifically address the issues brought up in the state audit report as well as the ongoing audit by the Department of Finance. We can appreciate the importance of the oversight role of the state auditor on legislative committees such as yourself, and please know that I'm committed not only to spending the ARA funds effectively and on time, but also being responsive to you. And here in the legislature, so you can have a clear picture of how and where the money is being spent and how it is helping with your constituents. With that, I will turn it over to Mr. Oglesby.
Good morning, Chairman Lara and committee members. I'd like to join my chairman in stressing the Energy Commission's commitment to ensuring the full utilization of federal ARA funds to create jobs and save consumers money through energy efficiency. I'm committed to providing the legislature with frequent reports on the progress of ARA projects. Just 2 weeks ago, I testified before the Senate Energy and Public Utilities Committee on the status of the Commission's $226 million ARA state program, and I provided the first monthly report to the Senate Energy Committee and this committee on August 15th. As you've heard, there's a large unexpended state energy program fund balance. About 3/4 of the funds remain in our account. I can report that all $226 million have been encumbered and contracts have been executed with award recipients. However, encumbered does not mean expended. Under federal rules, the Energy Commission can expend ARA funds only after receiving invoices after the work has been completed. Staff is working quickly with recipients to accelerate their invoicing to draw down funds more quickly, but we are aware that a great deal of work by the recipients remains to be completed and invoiced in a compressed time frame. And for the committee, this file does not hold multiple invoices for multiple projects. This is the invoices for one jurisdiction. So an invoice, the invoicing process is observed by State Auditor Howell and the other witnesses is very detailed, very administratively burdensome, and it is the recipients of the awards who, after completing the work, need to complete the paperwork process and submit it to us after the fact. Only then are the accounts shown as being drawn down, and so there's a great deal of challenge in not only getting the work done, and a great deal of work remains to be done, but also completing the process and submitting the paperwork to us so we can draw down the accounts. The federal terms require state energy program recipients complete their installations or retrofits by April 30th, 2012. As expected, program expenditures have been accelerating this summer as project installations are finished and invoices submitted. We expect the program expenditures to continue to accelerate through the end of the calendar year. And on that point, in terms of looking at projecting forward expenditures of the program, I think it's fair to say, as it was observed by the state auditor, that there was a delay in getting the program started, getting the rules out from the federal government, and that certainly hampered quick award of the funds. Secondarily, there's a great deal of startup time, both from the Energy Commission standpoint, but also for the programs that receive funds and have to line up the projects and get the work done. We expect that it is not a straight line process where you can look at the performance over the last year, for example, and just do a straight line. Right now the programs are started up, and we expect to see that now the programs and the infrastructure, the workers have been hired, that the progress on the reports, on the projects and the reporting, invoicing can be done on an accelerated basis. In its July 14th letter, the Bureau of State Audits commented they could not verify the Commission's efforts to monitor the status of the projects. At the time, the Energy Commission staff provided the Bureau with its best evidence of documentation related to project monitoring, including materials from the monitoring training that every Commission project manager attended, lists of subrecipients scheduled for on-site monitoring performed by our CPA contractor, Perry Smith, and demonstrations of our internal project monitoring systems. Project managers use the Project Information Management System and the Energy Commission our reporting system to track the project expenditures, job creation, and project status. In addition, staff monitors monthly progress reports for each project recipient and provides administrative and technical assistance to all recipients. However, we take the state auditor's assessment as well as the concern expressed by the legislature, very seriously. As a result, we have bolstered our oversight and accountability of the state energy program by engaging the Department of Finance, Office of State Audits to evaluate recipients' projects, verifying progress, and identifying obstacles. This involved on-site examination of progress and verification of documentation. The results of that effort are nearly complete. We'll have a much better assessment of project status thanks to that effort. I want to assure the committee that the Commission provides assistance to recipients when it is determined that a project is likely to fall short in fulfilling its obligations within the deadline. When it becomes necessary, the Commission redirects unspent funds from underperforming projects to projects that have demonstrated a better track record. For example, in June, $7.2 million of the State Energy Program funds were reallocated to 3 existing high-performing projects. The Commission also reallocated $1.3 million from the Employment Training Panel on the Job Workforce Training to the Employment Development Department Green Jobs Training project, which was discussed a little bit earlier. The Department of Finance audit will help us identify projects that may need additional assistance or reallocation of potentially unused funds. In closing, the Energy Commission is committed to ensuring that all ARA projects will be completed by their federal program deadlines and the full range of energy and employment benefits are achieved. I am happy to respond to any questions you may have.
Thank you. My question is actually to the chairman. I'm finding it very difficult to believe we're going to be able to spend, 80% of the funds in such a short amount of time. Can you just run through me how we expect to get this done in such a short amount of time?
What we are doing, when I became chair in February, we put in place a monthly monitoring system so we could try to track progress. Now, what we've done now is with the Department of Finance, we've gone out to, again, ground truth the status. And what we're finding is that, again, our information only includes what's been invoiced. There's a lot more progress on the ground, but I certainly share with you the concerns. And what we're trying to find is those projects which have a good track record that we can expand. We will do those. Those projects which are being held up on invoicing because of, say, Davis-Bacon problems, we're working with the contractors so they can resolve those problems and get the invoices into us. We're certainly working with, as we find problems, we're trying to address the problems. So we certainly share your concerns. And as I said, at this point, I've made it one of my top priorities. I have a new executive director. We've hit the ground, and we're trying to really deal with these issues, although it's hard. And we're certainly looking at every option we can have to make sure that these funds are spent, but also that they're spent effectively.
Right. And Chairman, I would advise you to just stay vigilant on the spending side, ensuring that I know, and I'm assuming this, some mad rush of expenditures, that we make sure, we protect taxpayers' money and ensure it's done efficiently and remove any concern that we might have in terms of, quite any questionable expenditures for that. But with that, this question is for the executive director. Can you run me through what, for a project, how we expend the money, how do we invoice folks, how do we get those invoices back? I'm just trying to figure out where we get caught up in terms of the process. And I understand that there's various regulations from the feds. I'm just trying to, in my head, picture how the whole process kind of unveils.
Well, the process is actually fairly cumbersome, and it involves awarding the contracts, initially defining the work, and then entering into agreements with the parties that receive the funds. Then it involves monitoring the progress made on it. The recipients of the funds, and they basically fall into multiple categories that include grants and loans to public and private, and also training funds. So depending on the project, it kind of dictates the structure of the activities that follow up. But basically, what you see before you here is the type of invoice that comes in that has to document that the work was done, that it's qualifying work, and that the workers were eligible under the.
So that's for one project?
This is for one jurisdiction.
Okay, got it.
And this isn't the biggest one we have, but it's a representative sample. But it's an indication of that it's not just a matter of getting the contractors and the subs secured under the program, having them do the work, and then submit a bill like this, right? The administrative burden of this program is immense, and it's immense on the part of the recipients and those that are doing the work. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Go ahead, Mr. Alejo.
Well, of course, this I know it's the most concerning for you, and it certainly would be a travesty to see these large sums of money be returned during in this economy where we could really be putting it to use. Besides the invoices, what other? You said you were verifying obstacles. What are those other obstacles, and what corrective measures has the Energy Commission taken to address those?
Thanks. I really appreciate the opportunity to respond to that question, because there are quite a variety of them. Some of them are helping jurisdictions just learn what the rules are and how they need to comply with the rules. Others is a learning curve on behalf of the awardee, that projects may not be designed as well as they were intended, or performing as well as they intended, and so it involves some adjustment. For example, a local recipient targeted their weatherization program and energy efficiency program to allocate a large amount of money for single-family home improvements. That market was moving very slowly. They adapted during the process by shifting their focus to multifamily, and that's been much more successful in moving the funds. Others have been slow to start, and I think the state auditor observed that, and our verifications that are in the field have indicated that some have been very slow to start for whatever reason. Some of these funds went to private industries and energy-related industries for loans, and for those, that's probably going to be the type of thing that we have to reallocate the funds and apply them to more productive and successful projects.
But was there enough jurisdictions applying, or was there enough applicants or projects applying to utilize the fund? Was there a problem of just people having a sheer number of projects applying for these funds? Was that an issue?
Well, do you want to?
I was going to say we had lots of applicants. I think the difficulty was for some of the applicants, once they got the awards and realized they had to deal with Davis-Bacon, they had to deal with a waste management plan, they had to deal with CEQA NEPA, they had to deal with an architectural heritage, they had to deal with those level of invoices. Some of them at that point dropped out, which then caused us to have to reallocate the funds. So that what we have found literally is, for these we had a lot of people interested, and as they found out what it entails, we had some dropouts, but literally we have to go through every single contract, and the problems tend to be unique for each contract that we're trying to address, and so it's very time intensive. But again, we're definitely working on those. Davis-Bacon, it's more the complying with it has been an issue, and we've had a number of staff training people on how to comply with Davis-Bacon, the documentation.
And my last question was just for state auditor. It's like, what are we in the context of the rest of the country in terms of these the same challenges we're facing? Are other states? I don't know if you give us contextualize this problem. If other states are facing similar challenges, or is this something unique to our state?
Well, I'm not familiar with what specifically other states' challenges are with regard to the state energy program. Davis-Bacon absolutely was a concern for all states. Many states, similar to California, under the traditional federal programs or federal grants that we administer, besides the Recovery Act, as the previous witness for the CSD indicated, normally we don't have to comply with Davis-Bacon under traditional grants that we receive from the federal government. The Recovery Act added that, or basically modified that requirement to require the state of California and all states to comply with Davis-Bacon. So that certainly was a challenge, and that's something we pointed out in our early reports when we reported out on Energy Commission back in December of 2009, and then the weatherization program, we issued our report in February of 2010. But with that said, I think we also have to put things into context here. We issued our report in December of 2009, and at that point in time, the Energy Commission was reporting out that they had spent $40 million. Here we are almost 2 years later, and they're indicating they've spent about $70 million, which when we went in to try to confirm that, we took that down to about $48 million. So there's been a long period of time, with all due respect to the Commission, because I know this isn't easy, there's been a long period of time for us to be working with the federal government and trying to work with both the state agencies, because that $40 million went to 2 state departments, EDD and DGS, and we still haven't spent all the funding for those 2 programs. And those 2 years ago had already been awarded. So I think there are some new requirements that came through with the Recovery Act, but with all due respect, a lot of time has passed, and we had the opportunity to address some of these issues. That's part of why we issued our original report, to identify what the issues might be, to try to get the state prepared and aware of what we needed to address, and why we continued to monitor not only this program but other programs, because we don't. And I know the Energy Commission doesn't want to, have any funds revert back either. But hopefully that answers your question. I don't know specifically. I can certainly get some of that information for the committee and get it back to you to see, because we could look at what the U.S. Department of Energy is reporting out as they're monitoring, because they're monitoring various programs, and also our federal equivalent, called the Government Accountability Office, had a responsibility to monitor, and I know the State Energy Program was one that they monitored. So we might be able to get some comparative information for the committee. I think that would be very helpful
if we could get that information.
Because I think that if other states are showing that they're able to reach their goals and use that funding effectively and in a timely manner, then that really question comes back to the Energy Commission: is if other states are making it work, why haven't we addressed the problems here in California? So that information would be helpful.
Thank you, Mr. Alejo. Ms. Howe, I have a question for you. Mm-hmm. How do we? What do you recommend we do? How do we move forward from here? I mean, I think it is a gargantuan kind of task that we're what the commission has. I would like to see some sort of report, maybe like where we have 8 months, maybe halfway in January, to see what's been done in terms of spending the ARA monies. But I'm trying to figure out how can we be helpful to the Energy Commission to make this happen in a timely manner? Well,
I think one of the things that the Energy Commission actually is doing, and I think some of the information that they have perhaps can help, is they do get progress reports, it's my understanding, from these different projects. So they may not necessarily have received an invoice yet, but if they're getting progress reports from particular projects, then perhaps they could lay that out in either a spreadsheet or something. I mean, I don't want to cause more work for them, but to be able to identify, here are the projects that maybe the expenditure is only 20%, but the progress of this, based on what the entities are asserting, is 80%. So we're feeling pretty good there. Or we're seeing, they're showing expenditures of 10%. And wow, when we look at the progress reports, we're only seeing 15% progress. That raises a red flag to try to prioritize, because when we issued this report in July, we were looking for a plan. What kind of a plan do you have for redirecting? I know Mr. Oglesby identified, $7 million was redirected, and then another 1.2 or 1.5 million was redirected. That's only $8 million out of $180 million that's unspent. So really, I think that would be helpful. Again, they wouldn't have the ability to go out and verify a lot of that. I don't know what finance, to be honest with you, I don't know what finance has done for them. But if they do have those kinds of progress reports where they could highlight programs that, again, may show a small amount from an expenditure perspective, but perhaps do show progress, that might be a way to try to get at some of this. Because the other thing is, if you're talking about redirecting or developing new programs, there's not enough time. Right. We only have 8 months. Mm-hmm. So we've got to find out who out there is successful right now and start and find out, could you use more funds? Because if you have more of a demand for whatever type of service you're providing or these particular programs, then let's if to the extent we can, shift those resources over to those programs that are at least seemingly more successful with regard to their progress. So that's...
Is that type of reporting possible? I mean, is that going to be more burdensome for you guys?
Not at all. Actually, this is very gratifying to hear that suggestion. That's the direction that we're going. That's we provided a report that made our preliminary assessment of the project status and their likelihood to complete. That was on the August 15th, as I testified, and thankfully the Department of Finance Office of State Audits has gone out to every project in the field and verified documentation, made and done a real in-depth look at it. We will be benefiting from that information, and that would be feeding into the next monthly report, which I've committed to, which should come out on or about the 15th of September. So at that point, then we can go forward and do this kind of reallocation, kind of triage, if you will, to see whether further allocations. And it's a tough decision to make to reallocate money, because basically you are intervening in the award of finances to localities and basically making an assessment that they're not going to meet the finish line and then pulling money back from those jurisdictions. That's a serious step to take.
Right.
It has implications that I'm sure you can anticipate. And you want to also make sure that the local jurisdictions have as much opportunity to successfully complete the projects and do a reality check to make sure they can do that, because in the end you want to make sure they get the jobs and the energy benefits at the local level.
Right.
And not pull money back prematurely. So it's a balancing act. But the state auditor's words are well taken. There's 8 months left. The balances in our account are very high, and there's quite a bit of process that remains to be done.
Now, is there any, I mean, I don't even know if this is possible. Can we get an extension from the feds? Is that a possibility? Or
there are, from other state agencies, or at least as you heard earlier, there was a request for an extension. We are in constant contact with the Department of Energy. They have not been as revealing about whether we can count on an extension. Our goal right now is to make sure that the funds and the benefits of those funds are delivered as quickly as possible and within the times that are on the book. However, as we receive the final report from the Department of Finance Office of State Audits, we'll have a much better idea about whether the magnitude of unspent funds and whether we have, how many A students and how many C students
Right.
we have. So then we'll make a judgment on that. So there's always the opportunity to do an assessment and ask for an extension. We'll know better where we stand shortly. But the Department of Energy, at least from our point of contact, has not been willing to commit or handicap the likelihood of an extension.
that's why I think these reports that you're doing are so important, especially if you report them back to the legislature. And I think by January, halfway through this 8-month process, we'll be able to maybe engage our federal representatives to maybe try to help and seek out an extension if possible. But I think we need some sort of timeline to say, look, this is what's going on. And so I think maybe in January we should revisit this again, monitoring the reports that the state auditor mentioned with the details. I think that makes complete sense, but also gives us an opportunity to engage our federal representatives if we have to at that point. You have a tremendous job. I mean, I don't envy you at all. So I want us to be helpful here as well, but also want to make sure that the work's getting done, and that it's getting done efficiently and in a proper manner. So I say we continue to work with the state auditor, ensuring that we get those reports. And I think we revisit this. I mean, not necessarily at a hearing, but in our office to make sure that we if we need to engage our federal representatives, that we do that at least 4 months out, so that we can have some sort of a time to respond and maybe put some pressure at the federal government. I would hate to lose this money, and I know it's going to be tough. So are there any other questions, Luis? Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Our final topic is on the Department of Education. Their spending deadlines are September 30th of this year and December 31st of this year as well, and September 31st, 2013. Ms. Howell, you may proceed with the Department of Education report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you indicated, the Department of Education, this was some follow-up work we did under our high-risk authority, and we're in the Department of Education almost on an annual basis for most months of the year, looking at a variety of federal programs that the state of California administers that the Department of Education is responsible for. With regard to the Recovery Act, the state of California, through the Department of Education, received a total award of $6.3 billion. It was for 9 different grants, and those grants have various spending deadlines. As you indicated, there's one of the 9 grants that had a spending deadline of September 30th of 2010, so that one is finished. Another one is the end of this month, September 30th of 2011. 6 of the 9 grants will expire. The spending authority will expire December 31st of this year, and then a remaining grant we have until 2013, September 30th of 2013. So we did something similar as the other audits. If you look on page 3 of the letter, you'll see the various grants broken out by the spending deadline. So the first one I identified there, child nutrition, that's the one that expired last year. We had about $865,000 that went unspent. Some of this, when we spoke with the Department of Education, was the result of cost adjustments that were made after the fact, and some of their subrecipients actually had actual costs or incurred costs that were less than what they anticipated. So that $865,000 has reverted to the federal government. That was a year ago. The remaining grants in this table, as I indicated, the next one we have until the end of this month, and as you can see, there's about $27 million unspent. It's about 12% of this particular grant award. And then we have a series of 6 grants that expire the end of this calendar year. The spending deadline is the end of this calendar year. And again, as you can see, the percentages are not significant other than the education technology grant, which is about 47% unspent. That one we have some pretty serious concerns about whether or not the state's going to be able to expend all those dollars. The remaining,
which one was that?
If you about the 4th line down under those that have a spending deadline of December 31st, it says education technology state grants.
Got it.
We had $71.5 million awarded, and our amount unspent, if you go over to the right-hand column, it's about $33.6 million. So we're about 47% unspent on that particular grant. So that one we have concerns about. Let's stay focused on that grant. As I indicated, they've spent about $38 million. We have about 33.6 million unspent. When we looked at this particular grant, we saw the average spending was about $10 million per quarter. So if we only have 3 or 4 months left, we're concerned that some of this money will not be expended by the state of California, will actually revert back to the federal government. The other grant I just want to highlight in my presentation, and we talk about it a little bit in the letter itself, is the first one that's identified under this December 31st spending deadline, the Fiscal Stabilization Grant. I'm sure you've all heard of that. It was about $3.2 billion awarded to California. Now, the state has spent a significant amount of that. We're close to $3 billion, but we do have $205 million remaining to be spent. And that looks like, okay, we think we're doing okay. We've expended quite a bit of that funding. But we do have some concerns not necessarily at this level, but when you get down and you look at the local level, the specific recipients who have these awards and whether or not they're going to be able to meet their expenditure deadlines. So it's a busy table, but if you move to the next page, I'm just going to step you through one line item to kind of highlight what our concern is. So if you look at the second line item and you see State Fiscal Stabilization Grant, what we're trying to do with this table is identify the number of recipients that have either not spent any funds yet, have spent up to 25% of their dollars, or have been all the way over to 100%. So if you look at that line item, let's just stay there, and you see 41 subrecipients have not spent any funds yet. Moving to the next column, we have another 24 that are upwards of about 25%, between 1 and 25. And then the next column would be 26 to 50, and we highlight that. Here's 76 different entities that have expended less than 50% of their award. And again, we only have about 4 months left. So what we tried to do with this table is highlight for the legislature, and certainly for the Department of Education, we do have a fair number of subrecipients where we're not seeing a good pace of expenditure. So perhaps we need to highlight some of those and work with some of those entities to the extent we can. Now, one thing that the Department of Education told us, and I'm sure they will assert in their testimony here, and I think we would agree, is there is only a certain amount of authority they have over the local entities. They do correspond with the local entities and send letters to them, send inquiries to them about, you need to get this money spent. Our deadline is coming up. We only have until December 31st. We certainly don't want this money to go back to the federal government, certainly not any of the funds, but certainly not stabilization. So there's only a certain amount of work that the Department of Education, or encouragement, so to speak, the Department of Education can place on these local education districts. But again, we do feel that it's incumbent upon the department to do everything it can to work with the locals to make sure that the dollars are spent. Now, the one grant that expires in 2013, there's a fair amount of money that has not yet been awarded for that grant. But again, it didn't raise a significant concern in our mind. This is back on the prior page on the first table that we present. On page 3, you'll see only one grant, school improvement grant, and of the $351 million that the state of California received as an award, the amount thus far that education has granted or awarded out is only $120 million. But we're not seriously concerned about this yet because we have a full 2 years. But we felt it was important to highlight it, just to keep it on the radar and say, okay, here's another one that, time flies, and let's just pay attention to it.
What is the school improvements grant? Like, what are the type of improvements are we talking about?
I knew you'd ask that question. You know what? I don't have the answer. You caught me. I don't know specifically what that grant is for, but I would defer. You did
for the first time.
I would defer to the department.
Let the record note.
Expertise. So with that, I certainly try to answer any other questions you ask, and defer to the department with some of the specifics.
Well, I think the department was awarded $6 billion.
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's not too shabby given the amount of the award. However, there's definitely room for improvement. I'm going to go ahead and call Ms. Carol Bingham here from the department. She is a senior fiscal policy advisor. Welcome, Ms. Bingham. And feel free to start with your presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members. My name is Carol Bingham, and I'm representing California Department of Education. Thank you for inviting us to provide information on our administration of the stimulus funds. The CDE is actually charged with administering a total of $7.5 billion in stimulus funds for K-12 education, including $6.3 billion from ARA and $1.2 billion from Education Jobs funds. My unit has been in charge of overall coordination of stimulus programs within the CDE, including managing the reporting process required by Section 1512 of the ARA. Section 1512 requires quarterly reporting on spending and the number of jobs created and retained. Stimulus funds come in the form of 10 grants. That's the 9 that Ms. Howell mentioned, plus the Ed Jobs funds. One's from the Department of Agriculture, one's from the Federal Department of Health and Human Services, and the others are all from the Federal Department of Education. To administer these grants, we made over 7,000 separate subgrants to over 2,000 unique subrecipients. A large majority of our subrecipients are local educational agencies, that is, school districts, counties, offices of education, special education, local planning areas, and charter schools. But some are nonprofits. For example, some child care agencies receive funds under the child care grant. The ARA and Ed Jobs funding have been lifeline for California schools. While programs have not wholly prevented layoffs, they've allowed schools to avoid much larger layoffs than the ones we have seen and to continue services that otherwise have been discontinued. Jobs saved have ranged from 17,000 to 35,000, depending on the quarter. We have been carefully monitoring the status of spending for each of the program areas using the data we've collected to satisfy the Section 1512 data reporting requirements of the federal legislation. Let me clarify what spending means in this context. It includes both expenditures, which is cash out the door for documented expenditure of some sort, and obligations, which is a binding commitment to pay a vendor at some future time for a service or good. So when we request reporting on spending, we're requesting reporting on either spending or obligations. As Ms. Howell explained, some of the grants expire in the current calendar year. For most grants, our deadline for obligation is September 30th, and the funds must be fully expended with all obligations liquidated by December 31st. And you may ask about possible, there's been some discussion before about possible change of the deadline where the feds might give us permission. We've heard from the Federal Department of Education that they are absolutely will not consider any requests for extension of the September 30 deadline. We can, however, get an extension of the date for liquidation, which is December 31st. Looking at the grants that will...
Have you applied for that, or is...
No, we have to wait to see where we are in September before we apply.
Got it.
But we certainly would intend to, and we anticipate that we probably will need to.
Okay, thank you.
Looking at the grants that will expire in the current year only, our subrecipients have spent, and I'm meaning either spent or obligated based on the reporting, 5.5 of the $5.9 billion that the state received, or 93%. $433 million remains unspent or unobligated. 65% of our subgrants are fully spent, and 90% are over half spent. Although a large majority of the funds have been spent by our subrecipients, and as the auditor acknowledges, our subrecipients are on track to spend all funds for most grants, we absolutely share Ms. Howell's concern about possible reversions of federal funds in some of the grants. Although the amounts are likely to be extremely small in percentage terms, any dollar that we don't spend and have to send back to the federal government is a dollar that's not available for California school children. I'm echoing what the chair said in his opening remarks. We anticipated this problem some months ago, and at that time developed a plan to encourage subrecipients to spend all the funds to which they're entitled. Here are some of the things we've done. We met with program staff from the programs that are actually administering the funds to make sure that their communications with subrecipients include information on the deadline for spending. We met with administrative staff, like accounting staff, to review timelines. We included reminders in our quarterly correspondence regarding Section 1512 reporting. In May, we sent a separate email tailored to each local superintendent with a report on the balance of the various grants under his or her jurisdiction. In June, we called subrecipients with unspent balances greater than $1 million, and earlier this month, we contacted program staff in the department and asked them to follow up on balances greater than $500,000. Actually, call these guys up. Unfortunately, there's only so far we can go to ensure subrecipients spend their grants and spend them before the deadline. They're entitled to keep the money until the end of the grant period, unless they voluntarily give up the grant and notify us that they're giving up the grant. And some did that in the case of very small grants that were not worth the paperwork in their view. We cannot and should not take back the money until the spending deadline is passed. The CDE actually believes that it was smart for school districts to save some of their funds until the final quarter, which we're in right now. Given the uncertainties of the state budget process, we believe this caution is consistent with the purpose of the funds. Finally, I'd like to spend just a minute on the education technology program, which is mentioned in the audit report and is not being spent at the same rate as the other funds. Here's the timeline for the grant. We received budget authority for half of the funds, or for the formula grant part of the funds, on June 21st, 2010. via a Section 28 letter. We actually awarded those funds within 3 weeks after that date. Budget authority was received for the competitive grants, the other half of the money, on October 8th, 2010. So that's less than a year ago. Within 45 days, we had developed and posted a request for applications, received and scored applications, and notified the subrecipients of their awards. That was lightning speed. Since then, we've issued a number of reminders about spending money by the September 30th date. We began monthly communications in December 2010 and have continued either monthly or semi-monthly, twice monthly, communications since. Most recently, reminder communications were sent weekly. We're now calling each subgrantee that has not submitted an expenditure report. You have to realize that for these grants, some of them are very small, so they're likely to not even bother reporting them until they've spent all their money.
What is small? What does that mean?
Like less than $1,000. That's right, Bill, right? $200.
Wow.
Yeah. Unfortunately, as is evident from the timeline, our subrecipients got a late start in spending these funds compared to the other grants. They're starting to spend the funds, and with all the reminders that we're sending, we have every expectation that they'll be able to spend a large majority of the funds by the due date. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Oh, do you want me to define the school improvement grant?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
That was the first question.
You have, I'm sure, read in the papers, if not heard through the legislature, of all the controversy related to NCLB waiver and meeting the deadlines for every student to be proficient. Well, what happens when school districts don't meet their targets is that they get thrown into what's called program improvement. And the school improvement funds are to help the program improvement schools improve.
Got it. Ms. Howell, my question is similar to the one I asked before with the Energy Commission. What your recommendations for any improvement that needs to be done with the department in terms to, especially on the technology state grants? Any thoughts there?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think overall, as we indicated in our letter, and I tried to indicate in my overall comments, I think the majority of the grants, we feel that they're well on their way to expend the dollars. I mean, as Ms. Bingham indicated, the percentages are small. The dollars can be high, but in looking at the pace of spending, the majority of the grants, we don't have grave concerns like we do at the previous presentations. The technology grant, I don't really have specific recommendations, anything any different than what I was suggesting in the previous presentation. If there are specific school districts or local education agencies that education is working with or is aware that has received these dollars, and maybe you identify, you may not want to try to chase down a $200 grant or a $1,000 grant because that would be difficult. But perhaps there are some that were larger blocks, and maybe prioritize your efforts as far as reaching out to those entities and suggesting, where are you at on this? Do you think you're going to be able to expend the dollars? Just try to be proactive and prioritize. We did see, as we indicated in our letter and Ms. Bingham indicated in her testimony, we did see reminder letters going out to the entities saying, you've received the money, the deadline's coming up, please report to us, any expenditures that you have, that sort of thing. So I would have to say, to characterize overall, I think the Department of Education has done a pretty good job of staying on top of the majority of these grants and exercising the authority that they have, which, and I don't mean this to be disrespectful, is somewhat limited as far as they can't force, as we acknowledge in our letter, they can't force the subrecipients to spend the money. They can just encourage and continue to monitor to the extent they can. But I think on the technology grant, again, just try to prioritize those entities that received larger dollar amounts than those that received the $200 or $1,000 grants.
Right. No, and another thought that came to my mind is there any way for the particular legislators to know which of the grants are out there in their specific areas? Because although you might not be able to put pressure and send them a letter, we can do that individually on our own. because I start thinking about my school districts and my county office of education, and ensuring my thing is we have money for our kids. We have to make sure we do everything we can to spend this money. So, is there anything that we can do in terms of legislators working with our local school districts?
We would absolutely welcome that, and at this point, we actually post data on the website about what the spending has been that's been reported through Section 1512, and that data are available on our website for each school district. And we have actually posted the March data was posted some time ago, and we're currently in the process of posting the June data. So I can advise you, give your staff the link if you want.
I would appreciate that, because I think we can maybe even do this at a larger scale with other members throughout the state to ensure that we're putting the pressure.
Yeah, we're also going to reach out to the county offices of education because they oversee the school districts in their area.
Great. Any questions? Go ahead, Mr. Alejo.
Well, one idea that I had, considering that this is especially for the education technology state grants, that why wouldn't there be additional measures that you can take? You said you gave out notices, but why not put a deadline, an internal deadline for school districts to expend the money before the grant is, before you reach your deadline, so that you have that time that if school districts those that haven't spent their money, and here there's 182 who haven't spent anything at all, another 63 school districts that haven't spent less than a quarter of their money, that those districts who are not expending it, it would give you the time to then say, if it's not spent by then it gives us the time to reallocate it to school districts that could use that money. I mean, I've attended schools whose computer labs are completely outdated. Even the monitors are just falling apart, not working, totally dysfunctional. There's plenty of school districts and classrooms that would like to have smart boards, for example. So these are technology that's not very expensive, but nonetheless, these grants could end up putting these tools into classrooms and put them to use. But putting an internal deadline saying you need to spend the money by this date, or else you're at risk that we're going to give that money to another school district, that's going to be the impetus for school districts to use it before the state is reaching its own deadline, and then revert that money back to the feds. And I also think the disclosing and making that information accessible to the public, local county boards of education publicizing what school districts haven't used the money locally, it would create the public pressure. I'm sure if any local parent group or press would go visit some local schools who lack the technology, and then to find out that a local school district hasn't spent that money, I think that would be a very easy way, by just providing public disclosure what school districts haven't used that money, to then push those elected officials and superintendents, and we got to be on top of that and making sure we're spending that money and providing that technology to our kids.
With respect to your first suggestion of setting a deadline, we actually have thought about that, but we think we would get a huge amount of pushback from our local educational agencies, and they're really right that the federal government in this program has given them until September 30th to obligate the funds. So we really think we'd be on shaky ground if we tried to implement that type of suggestion.
But as you said, these are relatively small grants.
Well, some of them are. There are also some fairly large ones in the other
percentage,
areas.
you said some were $100,000 grants, less than 1,000. What percentage of the overall technology grants fall in that category?
Bill, do you know? This is Bill Fong from our Data Management Division.
Good morning. It's about 40%. They get less than $1,000. So we have 1,100 LEAs that are under the formula grant.
Mm-hmm. A lot of those are charter schools, I suspect.
We have most of them school districts, charter schools, and county offices of education.
But in terms of the really little grants.
Yeah, the little grants, it's based on a formula. Percentage of Title I grants that they get. So if they get 2% of the statewide Title I formula, that's what they'll get, 2% of this small pot of $30 million for the formula.
Wow.
Oh, let me comment on his second suggestion. Actually, that's a really good idea, and we'll talk about that internally, about maybe issuing a press release saying, the superintendent is concerned that some money hasn't been spent, and make it a little more public that way.
Yeah, I think that's
just a thought. I
think it's a great it's a great suggestion, and again, I think it also boils down to us and our individual members in our districts to ensure we put that public pressure as well. Because in this era of cuts, this is an opportunity to put some public pressure to our local school districts to spend the money they need. And $1,000 might not seem like a lot, but for some school districts, it's greatly needed. I can tell you, we would use $100 and Montebello Unified. It won't be rejected, I can tell you that. So thank you again for coming today, and I think you're showing great progress, and I think you're well on your way, and however we can be helpful, again, definitely count on us. And thank you, State Auditor, for your report. Definitely want to stay committed, have the committee continue to follow each of the agency's progress. I invite each agency to come to any of us to seek assistance. The last thing we want is to, see any money spent or wasted, or eventually, or given back to the feds, given that, California is a donor state to the federal government. We want to make sure that we keep the money that we have here. And so I look forward to working with all the agencies that presented today, and with our state auditor and our committee members to ensure that that doesn't happen. And so thank you again for taking the time to come out this morning. This concludes our hearing for today.